It fits in the palm of a hand, a slab of dried river mud, thumbprint smooth at the edges, scored with small wedge-shaped marks that were pressed into it while it was still soft. Tablets like this one sit in the British Museum in London, in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, in Baghdad, in Philadelphia, in university drawers around the world. Thousands of them, and they are among the oldest writing that survives anywhere. This one is roughly 5,000 years old. And what it records is not a prayer, not a poem, and not the name of a king. It records grain. Somebody counted a delivery of barley and wanted a record that would outlast their own memory. They got one. It outlasted their city, their language, their gods, and their entire civilization. That tablet comes from the land between two rivers, in what is now Iraq. And this is the story of the people who made it. The earliest cities we know of, the earliest written words we can still read, the earliest laws we can stand in front of, the base 60 mathematics behind the clock on your wall. But this is also a story of endings, because the same land produced cities that starved, empires that vanished in a generation, and a written language that fell silent for 1800 years, until the world forgot that any of it had ever happened. This is the entire history of ancient Mesopotamia, and it begins with mud, water, and an idea. Chapter 1. The Land Between the Rivers. Forget everything you think a cradle of civilization should look like. There is no lost paradise here, no lush garden waiting for humanity to arrive. If you stood in southern Iraq 6,000 years ago, in the land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers, you would have seen a flat, baking, treeless plain running to the horizon in every direction. Summer temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Almost no rainfall, no stone to build with, no forests for timber, no metal in the ground. On paper, one of the least promising places imaginable to attempt anything ambitious. And that is the puzzle worth sitting with. Civilization did not take root here in spite of the hardship. A strong case can be made that it took root here because of it. Start with the two rivers, because they are the main characters of this chapter, and in some ways, of this entire story. The Euphrates in the west, slower and shallower. The Tigris in the east, faster, deeper, more violent. Both are born in the snowmelt of the mountains of eastern Anatolia, in modern Turkey, and both run southeast for well over 1,000 miles before reaching the Persian Gulf. On the way, they carry something more valuable than water. They carry mud, fine silt stripped off the mountains, dissolved into the current, and dropped, layer after layer, year after year, across the southern plain. That silt is why this story happens here. The plain of southern Mesopotamia is not really land in the ordinary sense. It is a gift of the rivers. Thousands of years of accumulated mud, and it is some of the most fertile soil on earth. Ancient records from the region boast of harvests returning dozens of grains for every grain planted. And while historians debate the exact figures, the underlying fact is not in doubt. When this soil gets water, it produces food in almost absurd abundance. Notice the condition buried in that sentence. When it gets water, this is the cruel joke at the heart of Mesopotamian life. Compare this land with the other great river civilization you already know. Egypt. The Nile was not effortless, and Egyptians dug, drained, and organized to farm it. But its flood arrived once a year with a rhythm so generally predictable that they built their calendar around it. The Tigris and the Euphrates offered no such rhythm. Their floods come in spring, fed by snowmelt hundreds of miles upstream, which means the people downstream could not see the danger coming. They arrive at the worst moment in the farming year, when the barley is standing ripe, weeks from harvest, and their scale is wildly unpredictable. One year the water barely rises, and the crops die of thirst. The next year, a wall of brown water erases every field, every village, every boundary line between one family's land and the next. Even in the 20th century, before modern dams, these rivers regularly drowned whole districts of Iraq. Now put yourself in the sandals of a farmer on that plain. Your soil is a miracle. Your water supply is a lottery. What do? You cannot move the river, so you organize. You dig a canal to carry water to fields the flood cannot reach. But a canal is not a weekend project. It takes hundreds of workers, coordinated over months, fed from a shared store of grain, directed by someone with the authority to say, dig here and not there. Then the canal silts up, because these rivers never stop carrying mud. So you must dredge it, every year, forever. You need labor rosters. You need grain storage. You need someone to settle the inevitable fight over who gets the water first. The farmer upstream or the farmer downstream. Look at what just happened in that paragraph. Organized labor, planning, food surplus, administration, rules. We have not built a single city yet, and the river has already pushed these people toward almost every ingredient a city requires. It may have pushed them somewhere else too, into a particular picture of the universe. Most of what we know about early Mesopotamian belief comes from myths written down much later. So we are reading their childhood through a diary they kept as adults. And that limitation is real. But the pattern in those myths is consistent and striking. The gods of Mesopotamia are powerful, immortal, and above all, unpredictable. In one famous story, they resolved to drown mankind, not out of justice, but out of irritation, because humanity had grown too noisy. Egyptian religion, by contrast, revolved around order, stability, and a well-provisioned afterlife. Mesopotamian faith reads like the theology of people who lived beside a river that might destroy them any spring, for no reason they could see. Scholars have long suggested exactly that connection. Standing on the floodplain, it is not hard to understand. When your world can end without warning, you do not assume the universe is fair. You assume it is powerful, and you learn to negotiate with it. One more feature of this land will quietly shape every chapter ahead. The plain has no natural defenses, no mountains to hide behind, no seas to stop an army, nothing but flat open ground in every direction. Wealth without walls. That combination made Mesopotamia, for its entire history, one of the most invaded and contested regions of the ancient world. Every people in this story, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, arrived at some point as newcomers to a land that kept absorbing newcomers. So this is the stage, a plain made of river mud, richer than almost any soil on earth and more dangerous than almost any neighbor. A land with no stone, no timber, no metal, and no protection. That would somehow produce the earliest cities we know of, the earliest writing we can read, and some of the first empires in human history. The rivers made the land. But rivers do not build cities. People do. And the first people we can trace in this impossible place walked into its marshes carrying almost nothing, looked around, and decided to stay. Chapter 2. Before the cities. A traveller from the northern hill country, arriving at the southern marshes 7,000 years ago, would have found the place close to unlivable, and would have been right about almost every particular. The far south of Mesopotamia was not yet the open plain of the last chapter. It was that plain's swampy edge, a world of reed thickets, shallow lagoons, and shifting channels where the rivers dissolve into wetlands before reaching the Gulf, clouds of mosquitoes, suffocating summer heat, water everywhere and nothing solid to build on. Up north, in the rain-fed valleys, farming villages had already existed for thousands of years, with stone for tools and hillsides for grazing. By that standard, this was the end of the world, somewhere around 6,500 years before Christ. Perhaps earlier, small groups of settlers moved in anyway. Archaeologists call their culture the Ubaid, after the mound in Iraq where their pottery was first identified in the 1920s. That name is ours, not theirs. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. They left no written records, because no writing system known to us had yet appeared anywhere on Earth. Everything we know about them comes out of the ground, from broken pots, house foundations, fishing tools, and the bones of their meals. And these anonymous people saw something in that landscape the northern traveler would have missed. The marsh was not a wasteland. It was a pantry. Fish in the channels, waterfowl in the reeds, wild boar in the thickets, dates from the palms at the water's edge, and everywhere, in unlimited supply, two materials the rest of the world barely valued, reed and mud. What they did with those two materials is one of the great overlooked achievements in human history. From bundled reeds they built houses, boats, and cattle byres, structures so well matched to the wetlands that the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq were still building nearly identical reed halls in the 20th century. A continuity of craft stretching across some 7,000 years. And from mud they made bricks, shaped in wooden molds and dried in the sun. Sun-dried brick sounds humble, and it is. It is also the material that would eventually build Uruk, and Babylon. The great towers of the ancient Near East began here, in the hands of marsh dwellers packing mud into boxes. Then they did something more consequential than any building. They began to farm the dry land next to the marsh. The soil beyond the wetland edge was the river silt of Chapter 1, fabulously fertile and completely dry. The Ubaid settlers cut channels from the natural waterways out into that dead ground, and the dead ground came alive with barley. These first canals were short and simple, probably maintained by single families or small kin groups. But the principle they established would govern this land for the next 5,000 years. Water moved by human decision. Fields located where people chose, not where the flood happened to reach. Excavations at Ubaid sites like Eridu and Tel El Awali have traced what happened next. And the pattern is quietly momentous. The villages grew. 2 acres, then 5, then 10. House sizes began to vary. Some larger, some smaller. One of the earliest whispers in the archaeological record of the gap between richer and poorer. And at the heart of the larger settlements, one building began to stand apart from the rest. At Eridu, near the ancient shoreline, excavators in the 1940s uncovered a sequence that still gives historians a kind of vertigo. At the lowest level, dating to around 5,500 years before Christ or earlier, a single small room of mud brick, barely bigger than a garden shed, with a niche in one wall and an offering table marked by burning, a shrine. Above it, a slightly larger shrine, built on the ruins of the first. Above that, another, and another. 17 or 18 levels of temples stacked through 2,000 years of rebuilding, each grander than the last, ending in a monumental platform, temple from the dawn of history. Later, Mesopotamian tradition, recorded in a document called the Sumerian King List, claimed that Eridu was the first city of all, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Archaeology cannot confirm a legend. It is still remarkable that the legend and the spade point at the same patch of ground. The word temple, though, can mislead us here, because our modern picture of religion does not fit what the evidence suggests. These buildings appear to have been organizing centers as much as houses of worship, places where surplus grain and fish were gathered, stored, and shared out. Some scholars read the early temple as a settlement's insurance policy against unpredictable rivers, collecting in fat years, distributing in lean ones. If that reading is right, one of the earliest institutions in human history began as a warehouse with a god living upstairs. Faith and administration fused in a single building. That fusion has a long career ahead of it in this story. And for the next 3,000 years, whoever controls that building controls nearly everything. By around 4,000 years before Christ, Ubaid-style pottery and architecture had spread across the entire Mesopotamian plain and beyond, from the Gulf Coast into Syria. How it spread is debated. There is no evidence of armies, and most archaeologists lean towards some mixture of trade, migration, and imitation. Neighbors copying a way of life that plainly worked. 2,000 years of patient experiment had assembled the pieces. Irrigation, brick, surplus, storage, the temple, a shared culture stretching across the plain. Nobody in those villages was building toward anything. They were getting through the year, burying their dead, and rebuilding the shrine a little larger than their parents had left it, layer by layer, one flood season at a time. They raised the ground the first cities would stand on. Chapter 3. Uruk, the first city. Around 3,500 years before Christ, something began happening on the banks of the Euphrates that, as far as the record shows, had never happened before. A settlement started growing, and it did not stop. Past the size of a village, where everyone knows everyone. Past the size of a town, where you at least recognize most faces. Onward, decade after decade, until by around 3,100 years before Christ, the city of Uruk covered, by many archaeological estimates, well over 600 acres, with a population that scholars commonly place somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people. The exact number is debated, and probably always will be. The rank is not. Uruk was the largest human community that had ever existed, and by most measures historians use. It earns the title it usually gets, the first true city. Its ruins still sprawl across the desert of southern Iraq, a field of mounds the size of a modern downtown, scattered with pottery that was thrown away before the pyramids of Egypt were imagined. But size is not the revolution. The revolution is what size did to human life. For hundreds of thousands of years, nearly every human being had lived among people they knew. Your band, your village, your kin. At Uruk, on a scale never reached before, a person could walk through their own home city, surrounded by strangers. The crowd had entered human experience. The freedom of it and the loneliness of it. The thing you can still feel on a sidewalk in New York or London or Berlin. People here were feeling 55 centuries ago. Strangers, it turns out, are a technology problem. A village runs on memory and trust. Everyone knows who owes what, whose sheep are whose, who worked and who shirked. A community of tens of thousands cannot run on memory. It needs systems. And the systems improvised at Uruk became standard equipment for civilizations everywhere. The center of the system was the temple, Uruk had two great sacred precincts, one associated with the sky god An, the other with Inanna, goddess of love and war. The deity later ages would call Ishtar. These were not quiet chapels. Archaeologists have uncovered monumental complexes there, rebuilt again and again on an ever grander scale, and the surviving records suggest the temples operated as the largest economic institutions in the city, controlling fields, herds, workshops, and enormous flows of grain, wool, and labor. One humble artifact hints at the human side of that machine. Excavators have found vast numbers of crude, mass-produced clay bowls of a roughly standard size, so common at Uruk period sites that they litter the ground. Many specialists interpret them as ration bowls, used to issue standard payments of barley to workers, though their function is still debated. If that reading is right, then a version of the paycheck is more than 5,000 years old, and it was made of clay. Now to the problem that gives this chapter its destiny. Imagine you administer Inanna's household. Grain arrives by the boatload. Wool comes in from herds numbering thousands of animals. Beer, the daily drink of Mesopotamia, is brewed and issued by the jar. Work gangs are owed rations. Farmers owe the temple a share of the harvest, and you are responsible for all of it, with nothing to hold the numbers except your own memory and your own word. For centuries, administrators across the region had used small clay tokens, little cones and spheres and discs, each shape apparently standing for a commodity, a measure of grain, an animal from the flock. To secure a deal, tokens could be sealed inside a hollow clay ball, like a contract inside an envelope. But to check the contents, you had to smash the envelope. One influential theory, built from thousands of finds, proposes what came next. Administrators began pressing the tokens into the wet surface of the ball before sealing them inside, leaving a visible record on the outside. Then came the leap. If the marks on the outside tell you what is inside, you do not need the inside at all. Flatten the ball. Keep the marks. Whether it happened quite that neatly, no one can prove. What came out the other end is not in doubt. The tablet, the earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3,300 or 3,200 years before Christ, are almost all accounting. Barley received, beer issued, workers rationed. The tablet from the opening of this story belongs to exactly this world, to these offices and these ledgers. On current evidence, writing appears to have been invented independently only a handful of times in all of human history. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt at nearly the same early date, later in China, and later still in Mesoamerica. The Mesopotamian trail is the one we can follow furthest back, and its origin is disarmingly unpoetic. The earliest readable words of our species are not prayers or poems. They are receipts. Writing was born so that nobody could cheat the warehouse. It did not stay a receipt. Within a few centuries, the marks evolved into the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, pressed into clay with a cut reed. And scribes discovered the trick that unlocked everything, using signs for their sounds rather than their meanings. Once you can write sounds, you can write anything. Names, sentence, laws, stories, lice. The scribal school appeared, and with it years of hard training, because the script ran to hundreds of signs. Literacy was born as a rare professional skill, and the scribe would remain one of the most powerful figures in Mesopotamian society for 3,000 years. From this same world comes the cylinder seal, a small carved stone rolled across wet clay to leave its owner's unique design. Part signature, part identity card, part guarantee. One more invention from this age hides in plain sight, and it may be the most durable of all. The scribes of Uruk counted in a system based on 60. Why 60 is debated, though it divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which makes it wonderfully practical for splitting rations and measuring fields. That base 60 system outlived Uruk, outlived Sumer, outlived Babylon, and passed through Greek astronomy into the modern world. 60 seconds in your minute, 60 minutes in your hour, 360 degrees in every circle. Check the time and you are reading at several removes. The arithmetic of temple accountants who lived 5,000 years ago. Who were these people? Almost certainly, by the end of this period, they were the people we call the Sumerians, speakers of a language unlike any other known on Earth, with no proven relatives living or dead. Whether their ancestors were the old marsh dwellers of the Ubaid, or newcomers, or a blend of both, is a genuinely open question. The Sumerians themselves, once they could write, showed no memory of ever having lived anywhere else. By 3,000 years before Christ, the experiment was complete and its results were spreading up the rivers, cities, writing, administration, the seal, the school, the counting. A stranger approaching Uruk would have seen walls on a scale the world had never known, and above them the temples of Inanna, whitewashed and blazing in the sun. But a city full of strangers raises a question no village ever had to answer. Who is in charge? The temple ran the economy. As cities multiplied and began competing for water and land, a different kind of figure would step out of the crowd. The Sumerians called him Lugal, literally big man. We call him the king. And with kings come the two great engines of the next chapter, glory and war. Chapter 4. The Sumerians. By around 2,900 years before Christ, the experiment that began at Uruk had replicated itself across the southern plain. This is the moment the story stops being about one city and becomes a world. Picture the land from above. Along the branching channels of the Euphrates, a dozen or more cities now rise out of the flat green fields, each visible to travelers from miles away. Near the sea, the great port, Eridu, the ancient shrine, Uruk, still enormous, then Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Shuruppak, Kish in the north. Around each city, a belt of barley fields, date orchards, and canals. Between the cities, open steppe. The first thing to understand about Sumer cuts against every instinct we bring from later history. Sumer was not a country. There was no capital, no single king, no united nation. Each city was an independent state with its own government, its own army, its own patron god. Nippur belonged to Enlil, lord of the wind. Ur belonged to Nana, the moon. Uruk to Inanna. The Sumerians shared a language, a religion, and a way of life, and they knew they shared it. Politically, they lived as sovereign rivals, sometimes trading, sometimes allied, and increasingly, as this chapter goes on, at war. If you want a familiar comparison, think of the city-states of classical Greece, Athens and Sparta and Corinth, or of Renaissance Italy. Sumer was running that pattern more than 2,000 years before Greece was born. At the center of every city stood the temple, raised now on high platforms of solid mud brick. The whole complex lifted above the plain on terraces that grew with each rebuilding, on flat land with no mountains and no hills. A temple platform was visible for miles, a man-made high place, and the instinct behind it would eventually produce the most famous silhouette of Mesopotamian civilization. The stepped tower called the ziggurat, the full ziggurat form, the giant staircase of terraces, familiar from every illustration, belongs mostly to a later century of this story, and we will stand at the foot of the greatest of them when we get there. But the idea was already growing here, and its meaning was already clear. To raise a mountain out of river mud, on land that floods, using nothing but human hands and mathematics, was a statement addressed to the gods. We are small, the building says, and you are great. But look what we can do. Now to the question the last chapter left hanging. Who is in charge? For the earliest cities, the honest answer is that historians still debate it. The temple clearly ran much of the economy. Early texts and later tradition hint at assemblies of elders and free men whose approval mattered, which has led some scholars to speak of a kind of council rule in the beginning, as the cities grew, and above all, as they began to fight. One figure moved to the center of the stage. The Sumerians called him Lugal, big man. Other titles appear too, and the exact differences between them are still argued over. One influential reconstruction sees the Lugal beginning as a war leader chosen for a crisis, whose temporary command hardened into permanent authority. And the evidence fits that shape without proving it happened the same way in every city. What is clear is where it ended up. The big man kept his position in peacetime. He passed it to his son. He acquired a palace, which now rose beside the temple as the city's second great building. The king had arrived in history, and he has never really left. The Sumerians told the story of their kings in a remarkable document that has come up twice already, the Sumerian king list, with surviving copies dating to around 4,000 years ago. One of the finest held today at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It claims to record every dynasty since kingship first descended from heaven. And reading it, you can watch legend and history fused into a single object. The earliest kings reign for absurd spans, tens of thousands of years each, figures of pure myth. Then comes a great flood. After the flood, the reigns shrink, the names multiply, and slowly they begin to match kings whose own inscriptions archaeologists have pulled from the ground. The king list is not reliable history, and historians treat it with care, as a window into how the Sumerians understood themselves. It is priceless. They believed their institutions were older than mankind, granted from above, interrupted once by catastrophe, and restored. Hold on to that flood. It returns in the next chapter, in the most famous story Mesopotamia ever told. What was life like inside these cities? Thanks to one site above all, archaeology answers with almost unbearable vividness. In the 1920s and 30s, a joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, led by the archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavated the city of Ur. In its cemetery, among thousands of ordinary graves, Woolley's team uncovered 16 tombs, so rich they are still called the Royal Tombs of Ur, dating to roughly 2,500 years before Christ. One belonged to a woman named Puabi, identified by the cylinder seal buried with her. She lay under a headdress of gold leaves and lapis lazuli that you can see today at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. Around these burials lay golden daggers, lyres decorated with bulls' heads, gaming boards, and drinking vessels of astonishing craftsmanship. Stay on that lapis lazuli, because it is a clue hiding in a jewel. Lapis comes from the mountains of Afghanistan, roughly 1,500 miles away. The gold likely traveled from distant highlands. The carnelian beads point toward the Indus Valley. In modern Pakistan and India, this poor plain, with no stone and no metal, was importing luxury from 3 directions across immense distances. paying with grain, wool, and cloth. Sumer sat near the center of a trade web spanning much of Asia, and it got there by being rich in the one resource that mattered: organized human labor on fertile mud. Woolley found something else in those tombs, and it darkens the picture. Alongside the royal dead lay rows of other bodies: soldiers at the entrance, court ladies in fine headdresses, lying in ordered ranks. In one tomb, dozens of attendants. Woolley believed they had taken poison and lain down in place. A whole household following its master into the earth. Modern re-examination of some of the skulls suggests at least some died from blows, which makes the scene harder to look at, not easier. Historians still debate what these deaths meant, and the practice appears in Sumer only in this early period before vanishing. But it tells us something chilling about how far the power of the big man had already grown. There were people whose deaths could be scheduled by another person's funeral, and the big men were finding more to do with that power, because the cities had begun to collide. The best documented quarrel is the border war between Lagash and Umma, two neighbors that spent generations fighting over a strip of irrigated land. We know about it from inscriptions left by the kings of Lagash, which means, and this is worth saying plainly, we are hearing one side of the argument. Around 2,450 years before Christ, a king of Lagash named Enatum commemorated a victory on a carved monument that scholars call the Stele of the Vultures, fragments of which are held today in the Louvre in Paris. It shows the king leading a solid block of infantry, helmeted men marching in step behind a wall of shields and leveled spears, trampling enemy dead while vultures carry off heads. It is the oldest known image of organized formation warfare anywhere on Earth. It is also, in effect, a war memorial, and like most war memorials, it was built by the winners. So this is Sumer at high noon, a constellation of brilliant, quarrelsome city-states, trading across much of Asia and bleeding each other over border ditches, a world of scribes and priests, of golden lyres and ration bowls, of man-made mountains and scheduled deaths, the first flowering of urban civilization, and, visibly, a system under strain, because a dozen armed sovereign neighbors on one open plain is not a stable arrangement. Sooner or later, someone would try to swallow the whole board. Before we meet the man who did, we need to meet someone else. Among the kings of this early age, one name on the Sumerian king list belongs to a ruler of Uruk who reigned, the list claims, for 126 years. The number is myth. The man may not be. And the stories that grew around him became one of the greatest works of literature the ancient world produced. His name was Gilgamesh. Chapter 5. Gilgamesh and the Invention of Literature. In the winter of 1872, in a workroom of the British Museum in London, a young man named George Smith was sorting broken clay tablets shipped back from the ruins of Nineveh in Iraq. Smith was an unlikely scholar. He had left school around 14 and trained as a banknote engraver, then taught himself to read cuneiform on his lunch breaks at the museum, until the museum simply hired him. That winter, on a broken tablet, he read a line describing a ship coming to rest on a mountain, and a dove sent out to find dry land, and the dove returning because there was nowhere to perch. A flood story, written down long before the oldest surviving texts of the Bible, and unmistakably kin to the story of Noah. According to accounts that circulated afterward, Smith became so excited that he began tearing at his clothes in the workroom. Whatever exactly happened that day, the announcement that followed made headlines around the world. The tablet Smith read was part of a much larger work, and that work is the reason this chapter exists. We call it the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is one of the earliest long works of literature that we can still read at length in its own words. Begin with the man himself, because he probably was a man. Gilgamesh appears in the Sumerian king list as a king of Uruk, plausibly reigning somewhere around 2,700 years before Christ. Later, Mesopotamian tradition credited him with building the Great Wall of Uruk, and archaeologists have traced a city wall there some 6 miles around. Beyond that, the historical Gilgamesh dissolves into fog. His fame did not. Within a few centuries of his lifetime, Sumerian poets were composing separate tales about him. Centuries after that, Babylonian authors wove those tales into a single, connected epic in the Akkadian language. And around 1,200 years before Christ, tradition holds, a scholar named Sineleki shaped the version scribes would copy for the next 1,000 years. The 12-tablet text scholars call the standard Babylonian epic. Sit with the strangeness of that. The poem was being written, revised, and studied across a span of time longer than the distance between us and the Roman Empire. Gilgamesh was ancient literature to people who are ancient to us. So what is the oldest of our great stories actually about? This is where the epic stops being a curiosity and becomes something that can still put a lump in your throat. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is introduced as the mightiest man alive, 2/3 god and 1/3 human, and an absolutely terrible king. He exhausts his city. He takes whom he wants, fights whom he wants, answers to no one. His people pray to the gods, not for his death, but for something wiser. Arival, someone who can stand up to him. The gods respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe who runs with the gazelles, a human being with no city in him at all. Enkidu is drawn into the settled world, hears of the arrogant king, and marches to Uruk to challenge him. The two collide in a wrestling match that shakes the walls. Gilgamesh wins, barely, and then, in one of the oldest emotional turns ever written, the two men embrace and become inseparable friends. Notice what the poem has done. It has taken the two halves of this story so far, the wild land and the walled city, and turned them into two men who love each other. Many readers, ancient and modern, have found in Enkidu's taming a meditation on what civilization costs. He gains bread, beer, clothing, and friendship. He loses the animals, who now flee from him. The poets of Babylon were asking, at the very beginning of literature, whether the city was worth what it took from us. They did not pretend the answer was simple. Together the friends seek glory. They travel to the great cedar forest and slay its monstrous guardian Humbaba. They kill the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar after Gilgamesh insults her. They are young, unbeatable, famous, and then the gods, keeping accounts as Mesopotamian gods always do, decide that someone must pay. Enkidu falls sick. For 12 days he weakens, raging at the unfairness of it, dreaming of the dark house of the dead where the inhabitants sit in shadow and eat dust. Then he dies, and the poem changes. Gilgamesh refuses to allow the burial for days, until, in one of the most quoted images of the epic, a maggot drops from his dead friend's nose. That single unbearable detail breaks him. The strongest man on earth has met the one enemy strength cannot touch. And the rest of the epic is not adventure. It is grief. Gilgamesh abandons his kingdom, dresses in skins, and wanders the wilderness, asking every person he meets a question that has never stopped being asked. Must I die too? His search leads him to the one human being said to have escaped death, a man named Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood. Here the story George Smith found on that broken tablet unfolds. Long ago, Utnapishtim says, the gods resolved to drown mankind. One god warned him. He built a great boat, loaded his family and animals, and rode out a storm so terrible that the gods themselves cowered like dogs against the walls of heaven. He released birds to find land. Afterward, he was granted immortality, as a one-time exception, never to be repeated. The parallels with the later story of Noah are so close, down to the birds, that most scholars see the biblical flood narrative and the Mesopotamian versions as branches of one ancient tradition, with the Mesopotamian branches attested many centuries earlier. This is why Smith tore at his clothes. On that day, in 1872, the Bible acquired an older relative, and the modern study of the ancient Near East caught fire. Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh nothing but tests he fails. The king cannot even conquer sleep, let alone death. He is handed one consolation prize, a plant from the depths of the sea that restores youth. And in the epic's cruelest scene, while Gilgamesh bathes in a cool pool on the journey home, a snake slips out of the water and eats it, shedding its skin as it goes. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. Everything he has done has come to nothing. And then he goes home. That is the ending. And it is a far greater ending than it first appears. Arriving at Uruk, Gilgamesh looks up at the great wall he built, and the poem's final lines simply describe that wall, its brickwork, its foundations, the city it protects. Readers have argued over those lines for a century and a half, but the most common reading is also the most moving one. Gilgamesh does not find immortality. He finds the only version of it available to a human being, the work that outlasts you, the city that stands after you are gone. The poem itself is the proof, because the king of Uruk has been dead for nearly 5,000 years. And here we are, still saying his name. One more scene before we leave him. The fullest surviving copies of the epic came from a royal library at Nineveh. Gathered in the 600s before Christ by an Assyrian king, we will meet near the end of this story. Those tablets lay under the ruins of a burned palace for some 2,500 years, until the excavators of the 1800s shipped them, broken, to London. The flood tablet George Smith read is on display in the British Museum today, a few rooms away from the barley accounts where this story began. Between those two kinds of clay, the receipt and the epic, lies the whole discovery of what writing could do. First we counted grain. Then, within 1,000 years, we were asking why we have to die. The civilization that could ask that question was about to face a more immediate one. North of Sumer, around the city of Kish, populations speaking a very different language had been growing for centuries. Semitic speakers, whose tongue we call Akkadian, neighbors and partners of the Sumerians since early times. Among them, around 2,300 years before Christ, a man was rising from total obscurity. Later legend said he began as a gardener's foundling, set adrift as a baby in a basket of reeds on the river. His name, or the name he took, meant the true king, which is usually what people call themselves when the claim is in doubt. History remembers him as Sargon of Akkad. Chapter 6. Sargon of Akkad, the First Empire. Around 4,300 years ago, one man tested a political idea that rulers have been reaching for ever since. The idea that a single throne could govern many peoples, many languages, and many cities that never asked to be governed. Nothing on this scale had been held together in this land before, and what his experiment revealed, in its triumph and in its collapse, would be relearned by every empire that followed. An honest warning first. Sargon of Akkad is one of the most famous figures of the ancient world, and much of what is popularly told about him comes from legends written down long after his death. The most famous legend says his mother was a priestess who bore him in secret, set him adrift on the river in a basket of reeds sealed with bitumen, and that a gardener drew him from the water and raised him. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the story told of Moses, attached to a Mesopotamian king in texts that predate the biblical account as we have it, and scholars still debate how the two traditions relate. What we can say more firmly comes from his own inscriptions, preserved in later copies, and from chronicles. He was not born to a throne. He appears to have served at the court of the king of Kish. Tradition says, as a cupbearer, a position much closer to power than it sounds. Then he took power for himself. Even his name is a claim rather than a fact. Sharukin, in Akkadian, means something like the king is legitimate. As a rule in history, rulers, secure in their legitimacy, do not need to put it in their name. Whoever he really was, what he did next is documented in outline, and it changed the logic of politics in this land permanently. Sargon built a new capital called Akkad, a city so thoroughly lost that archaeologists have never securely located it, though most believe it lies somewhere near modern Baghdad, possibly under the water table or beneath the sprawl of later cities. From that base, he did what no Lugal had done. He did not fight his neighbor over a border ditch. He set out to take everything. His inscriptions and later tradition record campaigns that broke the great city of Uruk, tore down its famous wall, and captured its king, city by city. Lagash, Ummah, the whole quarrelsome constellation of Sumer went down before his army. His texts boast that he washed his weapons in the sea, meaning the Persian Gulf, a ritual way of saying he had conquered to the edge of the world. Then he turned and marched the other way, up the rivers toward Syria, toward the cedar forests and the silver mountains of Anatolia. Consider how strange the thing he was building really was. A Sumerian city-state made a kind of natural sense. One city, one god, one irrigation system, one people. Sargon's realm had no such logic. It contained Sumerians in the south and Akkadians in the north, speakers of two utterly unrelated languages. It contained dozens of cities, each with its own proud history and its own patron god, most of them conquered by force, and none of them grateful. Nothing held it together except the will of one man and the army he fed. That is what an empire is, and every empire since has faced Sargon's problem. How do you make the conquered stay conquered? His answers have a startlingly familiar ring. He installed trusted followers as governors in the conquered cities, and his inscriptions use a phrase historians love to quote, that citizens of Akkad held the governorships of the land. One text has him boasting that thousands of soldiers ate bread daily before him, which may be among the earliest references anywhere to a force-fed year-round from the king's stores rather than raised at harvest time. Though how professional this army really was is still discussed. He standardized weights and measures across the realm, because an empire runs on taxation, and taxation runs on measurement. And Akkadian, his Semitic language, written in the cuneiform script inherited from Sumer, spread as the language of administration, beginning a career so long that more than 1,000 years later, kings of Egypt and kings of the Hittites would still write to each other in Akkadian, roughly the way the modern world uses English. But his most brilliant political move may have been made through his daughter, and she deserves your full attention, because she is one of the most remarkable human beings in this entire story. Her name was Enheduanna. Sargon appointed her high priestess of the moon god Nanna at the most prestigious religious office in Sumer, and the appointment was clearly strategic, placing a member of the Akkadian royal family at the sacred heart of the conquered south. Archaeology confirms she existed. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley's excavation at uncovered a translucent alabaster disc showing a priestess in ritual dress overseeing an offering, with an inscription naming Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon. The disc is held today at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. What makes her extraordinary is not the office. It is that a body of Sumerian temple poetry has come down to us bearing her name, including passionate hymns to the goddess Inanna, in which the speaker names herself, describes her own appointment, and recounts being driven from her office during a rebellion and restored. The surviving copies were made centuries after her lifetime, and scholars genuinely debate how much of the text is her own composition and how much was shaped by later hands. With that said plainly, here is what remains. Enheduanna is widely regarded as the earliest named literary author in recorded history, not the earliest named woman writer. The earliest named author of any kind currently known to us. Homer would not be born for well over 1,000 years. And the earliest literary voice that reaches us with a name attached very likely belonged to a woman, a princess, a priestess, and by her own account, an exile who fought her way back. The empire she served was mighty, and it was fragile in exactly the way its design predicted. Sargon's own late inscriptions and later chronicles speak of great revolts, of all the lands rising and besieging him, and of the old man breaking out and crushing them once more. His sons inherited the crown and the rebellions together, and each new reign began with the empire in flames and the army marching to reconquer what had already been conquered. The system reached its peak under his grandson Naram-Sin, who pushed the borders further than ever, took the astonishing title King of the Four Quarters of the world, and then went one step beyond. He declared himself a living god, writing his name with the sign reserved for deities. You can see the claim in stone in the Louvre in Paris, on the victory stele of Naram-Sin, where the king, larger than every other figure, tramples his enemies on a mountainside, wearing the horned crown that had belonged, before him, only to gods. It is one of the great images of power in world history, and within about a century of its carving, the empire of Akkad ceased to exist. What killed it? Later, Mesopotamian tradition had a theological answer. A famous poem called The Curse of Akkad claimed that Naram-Sin sacked the temple of Enlil at Nippur, and that the furious gods sent hordes from the mountains, the Gutians, to destroy Akkad and starve the land. Historians read that poem as moral literature, not reporting. The documented reality looks messier. Rebellions in the south, Gutian raiders from the Zagros Mountains harrying a weakened state, trade routes failing, and in recent decades, scientists have added a suspect the ancient poets could not have named. Evidence from lake beds and seafloor cores across the Middle East points to a severe drying of the regional climate around 4,200 years ago, and some researchers connect that event to failed harvests and mass movements of people. How large a role the climate played is still genuinely debated, but the picture the sources leave us is of a state stretched to its limits, hit by too many problems at once, unraveling within a generation or two. The Sumerian king list records the aftermath in 5 words that no historian has ever improved on. Who was king? Who was not king? Chapter 7. The Rise and Fall of around 2,100 years before Christ. With the Gutian interlude fading, power in the south passed to the city of where a king named Nama founded what historians call the Third Dynasty of or III for short. What he and his son built over the next century is one of the most astonishing states of the entire ancient world. and hardly anyone outside a university has ever heard of it. That obscurity is a shame, because Ur-3 came closer than any state of its age to running an entire society on paperwork, and its rise and fall reads like a case study written for our own time. Ur-Namma presented himself as everything Akkad was not, where the Akkadian kings were conquerors. He was a restorer. He rebuilt temples across Sumer, and above all, he built the great ziggurat of Ur, the towering stepped platform whose restored lower stages still dominate the site today. The best preserved ziggurat on Earth, and the fulfillment of the architectural idea we watched growing in Chapter 4. Uruk canals revived the Gulf trade and issued what is, on current evidence, the oldest surviving substantial law collection known to us, the laws of Ur-Namma, 3 centuries before the far more famous code of Hammurabi. The surviving copies are damaged and were made after his lifetime. But what remains is striking: fines and compensation in silver for many injuries rather than mutilation, protections framed for the orphan, the widow, and the poor, a royal preamble boasting not of conquest but of justice, of honest weights and measures, of the strong not exploiting the weak. Whether daily reality matched the poetry is a question the clay cannot fully answer. As a statement of what a king was for, it marks a real turn in political thought. And Ur-Namma's own end carries an irony the Sumerian poets noticed themselves. The king of justice died in battle, and a surviving lament describes the land's shock that the gods could allow it. His son Shulgi reigned for nearly half a century and turned the kingdom into a machine. This is the part of the story that sounds invented, and it is documented beyond doubt, because the machine wrote everything down. The administration of Ur-3 produced records on a scale that beggars belief. Something on the order of 100,000 tablets from this single century have been published, with more still sitting in museum drawers around the world. The densest administrative archive to survive from the ancient world. Their content is almost comically specific. Receipts for single sheep, dead lambs deducted from a shepherd's account, work rosters logging labor gangs down to fractions of a day, flour, beer, reeds, hides, boat cargoes, all of it counted, sealed, and filed at a site called Puzrish Dagan, near Nippur. The state ran a vast central depot through which livestock from across the realm was funneled, registered, and redistributed. Follow the thread from that barley tablet at the start of this story. 1,000 years of accounting practice, and it arrives here, at a Bronze Age state attempting something close to total information awareness, with nothing but reeds and mud. Shulgi standardized weights and measures again, reorganized the provinces, maintained the roads, and, tradition holds, endowed scribal academies at Ur and Nippur. He also revived Naram Sin's boldest claim and had himself worshipped as a living god, with hymns praising his literacy, his music, and his athletic feats, including a claim that he ran from Nippur to Ur and back, a round trip on the order of 200 miles, in a single day through a storm. Court poetry is not sworn testimony, and historians read those hymns as polished propaganda. But propaganda tells you what a society admired. Ur-3 admired a king who was scribe, priest, athlete, and accountant of the universe. It is worth asking what this machine felt like from inside. And for once the archive itself can answer. Because the tablets that count sheep also count people. Among the most revealing records of Ur-3 are the ration lists of the state textile workshops. Wool was one of the kingdom's great exports, and spinning and weaving it employed women and children on an industrial scale, with individual establishments recorded holding hundreds, and in some cases thousands of workers, listed by name, assigned to work gangs, and issued fixed monthly measures of barley and oil. The lists note who is sick. They note who has died, and adjust the ration accordingly. They note children, in lower ration categories, working alongside their mothers. Sit with what that means. Somewhere in a drawer in a museum today is a line of cuneiform that is the entire surviving trace of a woman's existence. Her name, her workshop, her barley allowance, and the fact that in a particular month she was not there to collect it. The state that could count a dead lamb could count her too. And because it did, she is not entirely gone. That is the double edge of this whole invention. The same technology that lets a government reduce a human being to a ration line is the only reason her name survived 4,000 years. For 2 generations, roughly speaking, the machine worked. Then the world changed, and the machine met the limits of machinery. The pressure came from 2 directions at once. From the west and northwest came the Amorites, Semitic-speaking, herding peoples of the steppe, moving into Mesopotamia in growing numbers. Some hired on as laborers and soldiers. Some rose high in the kingdom's service. Some raided. To the settled scribes of they were the image of the uncivilized. And one Sumerian text sneers at the Amorite as a man who eats raw meat and does not bury his dead. The state's response has a familiar ring across 40 centuries. King Shu-Sin, late in the dynasty, built a fortification wall, reported to stretch on the order of 170 miles between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and named it the wall that keeps the Amorites away. It did not keep the Amorites away. Walls across open plains rarely do, because people move around them, and because the forces moving people, drought, hunger, opportunity, do not read inscriptions. Some researchers connect this era of migration to the same long climate drying we met in the last chapter. And while the details are debated, the state's own records show the strain, with grain shortfalls and steeply rising prices in the final years. From the east came the second threat, the kingdom of Elam, in the highlands of what is now southwestern Iran, an old rival with a long memory. And inside the realm, the provinces began to peel away. An official named Ishbi-Erra, sent to secure grain, instead set himself up in the city of Isin and stopped answering to In the archives, the tablets thin out province by province, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of watching lights go off across a map. Within about 20 years of Shulgi's death, the empire that counted dead lambs could no longer feed its own capital. The end came around 2004 years before Christ. And for once, the poets and the archaeologists agree on the essentials. An Elamite-led army broke the city of sacked it, and dragged the last king, Sin, away in chains to Elam, where he vanishes from history. The third dynasty was over, and with it, the age of Sumerian rule in the land the Sumerians had made. We know how it felt, and that sets this fall apart from every fall before it. Sumerian scribes composed long poems about the catastrophe, and the greatest of them, the Lament for is among the oldest grief literature that survives anywhere. The poem walks through the ruined city, gate by gate. Corpses in the streets where festivals had been. The goddess Ningal weeping over her destroyed house, pleading with the great gods to spare her city, and being told, in one of the most chilling lines of ancient literature, that was granted kingship but was not granted an eternal reign, and that no one should trust in a lasting term of office. Read that line again slowly. Here is one of the earliest civilizations on Earth, writing its own epitaph, concluding that no institution is promised forever. Everything in this story was built by people who came to know that. Look closely, though, at what actually died. The dynasty died. The Sumerian language began its long slide out of daily speech, surviving afterward mainly as the learned language of religion and scholarship, the Latin of the ancient Near East. The civilization did not die. The cities were rebuilt. The canals were redug. The schools kept teaching. The scribes kept copying Gilgamesh. The merchants kept sailing to the Gulf. What changed was who sat on the thrones. And the answer, increasingly, was the very Amorites the wall had been built against. Within a century or two of Ur's fall, Amorite dynasties ruled across Mesopotamia, governing in Akkadian, worshipping the old gods, competing in the old way. One of those families held a middling town on the Euphrates that had never mattered much before. Its name was Babylon, and around 1800 years before Christ, that family produced a king whose name, 37 centuries later, is still shorthand for law itself. Chapter 8. Babylon and the Law of Hammurabi. In a gallery of the Louvre in Paris stands a finger of black stone taller than a man. It is polished basalt, over 7 feet high, carved around 1,750 years before Christ. At the top, in relief, a king stands before a seated god, the sun god Shamash, Lord of Justice, who extends to him the rod and ring of authority. Below that image, covering the stone on every side, run nearly 300 laws in fine cuneiform script. This is the Code of Hammurabi, and the question it raises is the question this chapter will try to answer honestly. Is this justice, or is this advertising? Begin with the city, because its rise is one of history's great underdog stories. When Hammurabi inherited the throne of Babylon, around 1,792 years before Christ, by the most commonly used chronology, Babylon was nobody. A modest Amorite ruled town on the Euphrates, one player among a dozen in the scramble that followed the fall of Ur. The great powers of the day were elsewhere. Larsa dominated the south. Mari controlled the middle Euphrates trade, and in the north, an aggressive warlord named Shamshi-Adad had assembled the first great Assyrian state. File that name Assyria away. That northern power returns late in this story, on a scale nobody in Hammurabi's day could have imagined. For the first 3 decades of his long reign, Hammurabi played the game the way a small king must. Dug canals, repaired walls, built temples, and waited. We know this period with almost eavesdropping intimacy because of an archaeological miracle at Mari, where excavators recovered a royal archive of thousands of letters. In them, diplomats gossip, spies, file reports, and one official famously observes that no king is strong on his own, counting off 10 or 15 kings who follow Hammurabi of Babylon, and just as many who follow each of his rivals. It is a snapshot of a multipolar world, alliances shifting year by year, everyone watching everyone. Then, around his 30th year on the throne, Hammurabi moved, and the speed of it still startles historians. In roughly a decade of relentless campaigning, he defeated an Elamite intervention, swallowed Larsa and the whole south, turned on his longtime ally Mari and destroyed it, palace and all, and pushed his power up the Tigris. The patient canal digger of 30 years revealed himself as one of the most calculating strategists of the age. For the first time since Ur fell, the land between the rivers answered to one man, and from this point forward, for well over 1,000 years, the southern half of that land would carry his city's name, Babylonia. But conquest is not why every law student on earth still hears his name. In the final years of his reign, Hammurabi had the great stone carved as a monument meant to be seen, and copies of its text were studied in Mesopotamian schools for 1,000 years afterward. What is actually on it? Nearly 300 rulings. Framed in a formula lawyers still recognize. If a man does this, then that follows. If a man puts out the eye of another free man, his eye shall be put out. There it is. The most famous legal sentence in history. An ear for an eye. Carved on this stone centuries before it appears in the surviving text of the Hebrew Bible. If a builder builds a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a surgeon's patient dies under the knife, the surgeon loses his hand. Read further and the picture grows more interesting. There are rules capping interest rates. Rules on wages for laborers and boatmen. Rules protecting a wife's dowry. Allowing women to hold property. And permitting a woman to initiate divorce in certain circumstances. There is debt relief for a farmer whose crop is destroyed by flood. This is not a primitive society scratching out its first rules. It is a complex commercial civilization regulating credit, contract, medicina, marriage, and rent. Now for the darker pattern, and the stone is perfectly open about it. The code divides humanity into 3 legal classes: free men of rank, commoners, and slaves. The penalty for an injury depends entirely on who was injured. Blind a nobleman, lose your eye. Blind a commoner, pay silver. Injure a slave, compensate the owner, as if you had damaged his property. An eye for an eye. It turns out, applied only between social equals. So, justice or advertising? A discovery of the modern era reframes the question. Scholars have studied thousands of actual court records from Hammurabi's Babylonia, real verdicts from real trials, and those records almost never cite the code. Judges do not quote its paragraphs. Some verdicts even contradict it. Many historians have concluded that the stone was never a statute book in our sense at all. Look at where the laws sit. Beneath the image of the king receiving authority from the god of justice, and read the long prologue and epilogue that frame them, in which Hammurabi proclaims himself the shepherd chosen by the gods so that the strong might not oppress the weak, and invites any wronged man to come before his stone, hear his rights read aloud, and praise his name. The monument is, at least in large part, a message to the gods, saying, I ruled justly, to posterity, saying, remember me as the king of justice. As advertising, it may be the most successful campaign ever run, because 37 centuries later, here we are, doing exactly what the epilogue asked, and yet calling it only advertising sells it short. Whatever the courts did day to day, the monument presented justice as something that could be written down, displayed on a scale nobody could ignore, and tied permanently to a standard the king himself claimed to answer to. How straight a line runs from that stone to modern ideas of the rule of law is a fair debate. That the stone was reaching for something larger than one king's mood is written all over it. There is a small irony in where we stand to read it. The stele in the Louvre was not excavated at Babylon. It was found at Susa, in Iran, because 6 centuries after Hammurabi, an Elamite army carried it off as war booty. And the greatest legal monument of Mesopotamia survived because somebody stole it. Now step down from the monument, because the old Babylonian world left us something the stone cannot give, which is the sound of ordinary people. This is the era from which we have the richest picture of Mesopotamian daily life. And 2 documents from it are worth the detour. The first is about school. The scribal academy, the Eduba, had become so central to this society that students copied out compositions about school itself. And one of them, which modern scholars usually call school days, walks us through a boy's day. He hurries in with his lunch, terrified of being late. He recites his tablet, copies his exercise, and is caned, by his own account, for talking, for standing up without permission, for going out without permission, for sloppy handwriting. He goes home and begs his father to invite the teacher to dinner. The father does, seats the teacher in the place of honor, pours him beer, dresses him in a new garment, and slips him a gift. And the teacher, suddenly warm, praises the boy's brilliant future. It is a comedy, written by adults who had survived the system, and schoolboys copied it for centuries, presumably with feeling, across nearly 4,000 years. It may be the most relatable document in this entire story. Homework, harsh teachers, and parents buttering up the school. The second document is about copper, and it has become an unlikely internet celebrity in our own century. In the ruins of Ur, excavators recovered the business papers of a copper merchant named Nasir, dating to around 1,750 years before Christ. Among the tablets is a letter from a furious customer named Nani, complaining that the copper ingots delivered were not the quality promised, that his messenger had been sent away, empty-handed and treated with contempt, and demanding to know, in effect, who does Nasir think he is dealing with? It is held today in the British Museum and is often described as the oldest known customer complaint in the world. The merchant appears to have kept it, along with other correspondence from dissatisfied business partners, in his own house, which suggests either a filing habit or a thick skin. Follow the thread once more. The technology invented so nobody could cheat the warehouse had, by now, preserved a schoolboy's excuses and a merchant's bad reviews. Grain, then poetry, then law, and now the small friction of ordinary life. All of it in the same wet clay. Whatever else writing turned out to be for. It had become the first thing in human history capable of remembering a stranger's bad day forever. One more legacy of this age touches you directly. Babylonian scholars of this era, working in the base 60 system, inherited from Sumer, produced mathematics of stunning sophistication, including a tablet held today at Yale University, catalogued as YBC 7289, which calculates the square root of 2 accurately to the equivalent of 6 decimal places. The sky-watching tradition that would eventually give the world the zodiac and mathematical astronomy was taking shape in the same schools. Hammurabi died around 1,750 years before Christ, and his empire began shrinking almost immediately. As empires in this land tended to do, his descendants held a diminished Babylonia for another century and a half. Then, around 1,595 years before Christ, by the conventional chronology, catastrophe arrived from a direction no one was watching. A Hittite army from Anatolia, 1,000 miles away, swept down the Euphrates, sacked Babylon, and went home. The raid ended Hammurabi's dynasty. It also announced something larger. The world had grown. Mesopotamia was no longer a universe unto itself. It was becoming one region in a connected system of powers, stretching from the Aegean to Iran, from Anatolia to Egypt. That connected world is where this story goes next. Into the first age of international diplomacy the human record preserves, and then into the century when, across much of that world, the lights went out. Chapter 9. The Long Bronze Age and the First Global Age. After the Hittite raiders burned Hammurabi's Babylon and vanished back into the north, something unexpected happened in the south. A people called the Kassites, mountain folk from the east, whose earlier arrivals had come as laborers and soldiers, took over the throne of Babylon. And then they did something no one could have predicted from that beginning. They gave Babylonia the longest run of stable rule in its entire history, on the order of 4 centuries, longer than the United States has existed. The Kassites are the great unsung custodians of this story. They came in as outsiders and became more Babylonian than the Babylonians. They ruled in Akkadian, restored the temples, maintained the canals, honored the old gods. Under their patronage, scholars gathered and edited the classic literature of the land. And it was in roughly this era, tradition holds, that the scholar Sine Leki Unini shaped the Epic of Gilgamesh into the version we met in Chapter 5. The Kassites also left a practical gift to archaeology: boundary stones, called kudarus, carved monuments, recording royal land grants under the protection of the gods, many of which survive in museums today. If the Akkadians pioneered empire and perfected paperwork, the Kassites demonstrated something subtler. A civilization can absorb its conquerors. Culture can outlast the army that defeated it. That pattern will repeat in this land until the very end of the story. But the real drama of this age is not inside Babylon. It is between the powers. Because the world of the late Bronze Age, roughly the 14 and 1300s before Christ, had organized itself into something startlingly modern. Call the roll: Egypt under its new kingdom pharaohs, rich beyond rivalry, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mitanni in northern Syria, and then, rising out of Mitanni's decline, Assyria, stepping at last onto the great power stage, Kassit Babylonia, holding the prestige of the Deep South, 5 or 6 kingdoms, in contact from the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf, all of them talking to each other constantly. We know this because we can read their mail. In 1887, an Egyptian villager digging at a site called Amarna, the ruined capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten, uncovered a cache of clay tablets that turned out to be the pharaoh's diplomatic archive. Close to 400 letters, held today mainly in the museums of Berlin, London, and Cairo. And one detail says everything about Mesopotamia's place in that world. The letters, written to and from Egypt, are almost all in Akkadian, the language of Babylon, pressed into clay in cuneiform. Egyptian pharaohs and Hittite kings corresponded in a foreign tongue because Mesopotamia's script and language were the shared operating system of the entire civilized Near East. The content of the letters is irresistibly human. The great kings address each other as brother. They exchange lavish gifts and then complain about them. And a king of Babylon writes to Egypt, grumbling that the last shipment of gold was disappointing, and that, in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust. So surely his brother can do better. That last line is diplomatic exaggeration rather than an inventory. And everyone involved knew it. Which is exactly what makes it feel so familiar. They haggle over royal marriages. And one Babylonian king, noting sourly that Egypt takes foreign princesses but never sends its own daughters abroad, receives the magnificently blunt reply that no daughter of the king of Egypt is given to anyone. They complain about ambassadors detained for years, caravans robbed in transit, messengers greeted without proper honor. Strip away the bronze and the clay, and you are reading the group chat of a superpower club, complete with status anxiety, gift receipts, and a great deal of passive aggression. Diplomacy in the full sense, with protocols and marriages and face-saving formulas, was up and running 3,400 years ago, and it ran in cuneiform. Beneath the royal theatre lay the economic engine that gave the age its name, bronze. The defining metal of the era is an alloy, roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. And that recipe carried a strategic consequence that shaped everything. Copper was available in places like Cyprus, whose very name is tied to the metal. Tin was rare, and much of it appears to have traveled staggering distances, with many scholars pointing to sources as far away as modern Afghanistan, which means the everyday tools and weapons of this world depended on supply chains thousands of miles long, crossing multiple empires, moving by donkey, caravan, and merchant ship. A shipwreck discovered off Uluburun, on the coast of Turkey, dating to around 1,300 years before Christ, was carrying some 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin, plus glass, ivory, ebon, and goods traceable to perhaps a dozen cultures. A single cargo hold containing the whole interconnected world in miniature. Some historians have called this the First Global Age. And whether or not the label fits perfectly, the vulnerability it describes is familiar. Every power's strength depended on connections. No single power controlled. Then, in the decades around 1,200 years before Christ, across large parts of that connected world, the system failed. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most debated catastrophes in history. The facts on the ground are stark, though they differ sharply from region to region, and that unevenness matters. Across the eastern Mediterranean, dozens of cities burn or are abandoned within a few decades. The Hittite Empire does not decline. It vanishes. Its capital abandoned. Its very name largely forgotten until modern archaeology resurrected it. Ugarit, the great Syrian port, is destroyed and never rebuilt. And among its ruins, excavators found tablets from the final days, including correspondence about enemy ships sighted on the coast, the words of a world watching its own end approach. Egypt beats off waves of seaborne attackers, its records call the peoples of the sea, and survives, but diminished. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces fall, and the script those palaces had used for their accounts disappears with them, so completely that Greek would not be written again for centuries. In a new alphabet borrowed from elsewhere. What caused it? No single cause convinces anyone anymore. Climate researchers have documented a severe drying trend around this period. Texts speak of famine and emergency grain shipments between kingdoms. There were earthquakes, migration, raiders, internal revolts. An influential modern view holds that the network itself was the weakness, that a world of long supply chains and interdependent palaces could absorb one shock, but not 5 at once. A world of bronze, tin, and treaties went down, not like a wall, falling, but like a web tearing. And Mesopotamia. Here, the regional differences matter most. The land between the rivers was battered, but not broken. Babylonia weathered hard times, and the Kassite dynasty eventually fell to an Elamite invasion around 1,155 years before Christ, in the raid that carried Hammurabi's black stone off to Susa. But the deep civilization endured. The cities, the script, the schools, the gods, all of it came through. In the north, meanwhile, one power emerged from the wreckage, with fewer rivals left standing than it had ever known, and with a very old conviction about what to do with that fact. Assyria had spent the Bronze Age as one member of the club, writing polite letters like everyone else. The world that grew out of the collapse would meet a very different Assyria. Chapter 10. Assyria, the war machine. Everything this story has built now funnels into one hard question. What happens when a civilization more than 2,000 years old produces a state that treats war as its organizing principle? The answer is the Assyrian Empire at its height. And before judging it, it helps to understand where it came from. Because Assyria did not begin as a monster. It began as a merchant. The Assyrian heartland lay in the north country along the Tigris, around the old city of Ashur, named for its god. And in the days of Hammurabi, its fame rested on trade, with archives from Anatolia preserving the letters of Assyrian merchant families running tin and textile caravans 1,000 miles from home. Assyria had farms, templars, courts, festivals, poots, and ordinary life, everything its neighbors had. But the north was a hard neighborhood, open to raiders from the mountains and rivals from every direction. And out of centuries of that pressure, the Assyrian state drew a conclusion that became central to its identity. Safety lies in striking first. Their god Ashur, their kings proclaimed, had commanded them to enlarge his land. Where a Babylonian king boasted of justice, an Assyrian king boasted of conquest, and described it as obedience. After the Bronze Age collapse thinned out the competition, Assyria began to expand. And from around 900 years before Christ, the expansion became systematic. What the Assyrian kings assembled over the next 2.5 centuries was, by common scholarly assessment, the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching at its height from Egypt to Iran, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Every land this story has visited: Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and far beyond. All of it under one throne for the first time. How? Part of the answer is that Assyria brought a professional's approach to something its enemies still treated as an emergency. The Assyrian state fielded what many historians describe as one of the first true standing armies at this scale, fed and equipped year-round by the crown. It was an Iron Age army in the literal sense, among the first to arm masses of troops with iron weapons. It was combined arms before the term existed. Heavy infantry, archers, cavalry replacing the old chariots, engineers who could bridge rivers on inflated skins and bring down city walls with siege towers and battering rams. Cities that had trusted their walls for 1,000 years discovered that walls no longer worked. Behind the army ran the empire's nervous system, a network of royal roads and relay stations that could move a message across the realm in days, an idea the Persians would later inherit and make famous. Then there is the other weapon, the one Assyria is remembered for: terror, used deliberately. As policy, the Assyrian kings did something few conquerors before them had done. They advertised their cruelty. Ashurnasirpal II, in the 800s before Christ, lined the walls of his palace at Nimrud with carved reliefs of sieges, executions, and prisoners, and his inscriptions describe flaying rebel leaders and displaying their skins, piling heads, burning captives. You can stand in front of these carvings today in the British Museum, and they were made to be stood in front of. Scholars broadly agree on the logic. The atrocities were theatre with a purpose: to make the next city surrender without a fight. Alongside the terror ran a quieter instrument that reshaped the human map of the Near East: mass deportation. The Assyrians uprooted conquered populations on an enormous scale, with some scholarly estimates running into the millions across the centuries, and marched them to new lands, breaking rebellious identities and scattering skilled labor where the crown wanted it. Numbers that large hide the thing itself. So bring it down to one family, exactly as the empire's own artists did. The reliefs from Nineveh, now in the British Museum, show deportations the way the army wanted them remembered. A line of people leaving a fallen city, a man leading an ox cart piled with household goods, a woman carrying a bag, a child riding on her shoulders. They are walking away from a place their family had lived in for generations, toward a province they have never seen, assigned by an administrator they will never meet. The empire's calculation was that their children and grandchildren would be easier to govern, cut off from the loyalties that had made the parents dangerous. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not, and deported communities held onto their identity for centuries. Which is why we know about this at all. When the Bible speaks of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, it is remembering exactly this machinery. After the northern kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria in 722 years before Christ, the policy was calculated and bureaucratically managed. It ran on lists. And by now, you know what lists in this land were written on. The same clay that once tallied barley at Uruk was now tallying human beings by the cartload. If cruelty were the whole story, Assyria would be simple. And Assyria is not simple. The same kings who piled heads built some of the most magnificent cities on earth. Sennacherib made Nineveh, on the Tigris, opposite modern Mosul, into a wonder, with walls miles around, gardens watered by aqueducts of cut stone, and a palace he called the palace without rival, and his grandson, Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, embodied the contradiction so completely that he could have been invented for this story. Ashurbanipal boasted of scholarship as proudly as conquest. He claimed he could read the oldest tablets, debate with master scribes, solve mathematical problems, and he sent agents across Mesopotamia with orders to collect the written heritage of the land. Every classic text, every omen series, every ritual, every work of literature, copied or confiscated and brought to Nineveh. The result was the library of Ashurbanipal. Tens of thousands of tablets and fragments, the most ambitious, systematically collected library the ancient world had yet attempted, assembled by the most feared man alive. And here fate arranged the twist this story owes to him. When Nineveh burned, the clay did not burn. Fire hardens clay. The collapsing palace sealed the library under its own ruins. And 2,500 years later, excavators shipped it to the British Museum, where a self-taught engraver named George Smith picked up a broken tablet and found the flood story of Gilgamesh. Chapter 5 of this story exists because of Ashurbanipal's library. Most of what we know of Mesopotamian literature survived inside the archives of its most violent empire. The fist and the library were the same hand. So why did it fall? And why so fast? At Ashurbanipal's death, around 631 years before Christ, Assyria ruled the Near East. Within about 20 years, it did not exist. Historians still debate the mix of causes. And the honest picture is a convergence. Decades of endless war had drained the heartland. Civil war between rival heirs split the elite. The empire's brutal accounting came due everywhere at once. Because a state with no friends has no cushion. Only subjects waiting. And 2 of those subjects found each other. In the south, Babylon rose in revolt under a leader named Nabopolassar. From the eastern mountains came the Medes, an Iranian people with their own grievances. Around 614 years before Christ, the Medes stormed the ancient city of Ashur itself. Then the 2 allies joined forces, and in 612 years before Christ, after a siege, Nineveh, the palace without rival, one of the greatest cities on earth, was taken, sacked, and burned. The ancient world could hardly believe it, and it did not mourn. A poet of the small kingdom of Judah, whose words survive in the Bible as the Book of Nahum, addressed the fallen city directly. Nineveh is laid waste, and who will mourn for her? Everyone who hears the news claps their hands. Read coldly. It is a victory taunt. Read fairly. It is the authentic voice of the deported and the terrorized, the family from the relief speaking back. And it belongs to the historical record as much as the palace carvings do. Assyria vanished so completely that within a few centuries, Greek travelers passing the grass-covered mounds by the Tigris no longer knew what they were. Its tools did not vanish. The roads, the provinces, the deportations, the intelligence networks, the idea of a state that governs a whole world. All of it was picked up by the empires that followed. The first to pick it up was the winner in the south, Babylon, the city of Hammurabi, silent under foreign shadows for centuries, was about to enjoy the most spectacular final act in the ancient Near East. Chapter 11. Babylon's Last Golden Age. For most people alive today, one name from this entire 4,000-year story rings instantly familiar. And it is this one, Babylon. The name reaches us through the Bible, through legend, through music and film, trailing images of towers, hanging gardens, captive peoples, and doom. Almost all of it comes from a single brilliant, brief golden age, the empire historians call Neo-Babylonian, and above all, from one king, Nebuchadnezzar II. His father, Nabopolassar, had led the revolt that helped bring Nineveh down. The son finished the work. And one date matters here. In 605 years before Christ, at Carchemish on the Euphrates, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar crushed the Egyptian army that had moved in to claim Assyria's leavings. The battle decided who would inherit the Assyrian world. And the answer was Babylon. Days later his father died, and Nebuchadnezzar raced home across the desert to take a crown he would wear for 43 years. What he did with those years had two faces, remembered by two very different sets of witnesses. And an honest telling needs both. The first face is the builder, and the witness is archaeology. Nebuchadnezzar poured the wealth of an empire into Babylon, and by most ancient and modern reckonings, the result was the greatest city of its world. Estimates place its population in the hundreds of thousands, very likely the largest anywhere on Earth in its day. Its defenses were so massive that later Greek writers described walls wide enough to drive chariots along the top. And while such reports are likely exaggerated, the excavated foundations are still staggering. The German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who dug at Babylon for nearly 2 decades, beginning in 1899, uncovered the processional way and the Ishtar Gate, faced in glazed brick of deep lapis blue, decorated with rows of striding bulls and dragons in molded relief. The gate was shipped to Berlin and reconstructed there, and it stands today in the Pergamon Museum, one of the most breathtaking objects surviving from the ancient world. At the city's heart rose the temple tower of the god Marduk, a ziggurat whose name was Etemenanki, the foundation platform of heaven and earth, rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar on an enormous scale. A colossal tower at the center of a cosmopolitan city where many languages were spoken every day. Many scholars see in it, or in memories of it, the inspiration behind the Bible's story of the Tower of Babel, though how directly the two connect is still discussed. The tower itself was real. Its footprint can be visited in Iraq today. And the Hanging Gardens, the wonder of the ancient world. Honesty requires a shrug. Later, Greek authors describe terraced gardens raised on vaults, watered by hidden machinery. Built, one tradition says, for a queen homesick for her green mountains. But the gardens appear nowhere in Nebuchadnezzar's own voluminous inscriptions, and excavators have never securely identified them. Some scholars defend a location at Babylon still unfound. Others suspect the legend migrated from the aqueduct-fed gardens of Nineveh. Some doubt they existed at all. The one wonder of the 7 that may never have existed is, fittingly, the one attached to Babylon, a city that has always been half real and half story. The second face is the destroyer, and the witnesses wrote scripture. the small kingdom of Judah, caught between Babylon and Egypt, gambled on rebellion twice. In 597 years before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem and deported its king and elite. When Judah rebelled again, he returned, and in 586 years before Christ, his army broke the city, burned the Temple of Solomon, and carried a large part of the surviving population into exile in Babylonia. The outline is confirmed by Babylonian chronicle tablets and by archaeology in Jerusalem, and its human reality is preserved in the most famous lament ever written. Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. The exiles wept beside canals, dug in a tradition as old as Sumer, and it was in Babylonia. Most scholars hold that Judean scribes and priests did decisive work, gathering and editing the texts that would become the Hebrew Bible. Those writers were living in a land where flood traditions, towering temples, and stories of infants set adrift in reed baskets had circulated for many centuries. And how directly any single biblical story was shaped by that encounter remains debated. What is not debated is the scale of the irony. The exile was a catastrophe, and out of it came one of the most influential bodies of writing in human history. Babylon the Destroyer became, unwillingly, a midwife. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 years before Christ, and the empire immediately began wobbling through short reigns and palace coups until the throne landed on one of the strangest figures in this entire story, Nabonidus. He was not of Nebuchadnezzar's line. He was devoted, to the point of obsession, to the moon god Sin rather than to Marduk, god of Babylon, which set him against the most powerful priesthood in the land. He was fascinated by the deep past, excavating ancient temple foundations and studying inscriptions of kings long dead, which has earned him, from some modern writers, the affectionate title of the first archaeologist. And then, inexplicably to his subjects, he left. For roughly 10 years, the king of Babylon lived at the desert oasis of Tamar in Arabia, while his son Belshazzar governed at home and the Great New Year festival, which required the king's presence, went uncelebrated. Later texts written under Persian rule complain bitterly about all of it, and those texts have an obvious interest in making him look bad. But even allowing for that, a kingdom built on ancient ritual had spent a decade watching its king neglect the rituals. And while Babylon argued with itself, the East was moving. In the highlands of Iran, a vassal king had overthrown the Medes and united the Iranian peoples, then swallowed the fabulously rich kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. His name was Cyrus, called the Second, remembered as Cyrus the Great. And by the 540s before Christ, his Persian empire wrapped around Babylonia on 3 sides, like a closing hand. 60 years after Nineveh fell to the fathers, the Sun City stood alone, against a new world power, trusting in the mightiest walls on earth. Chapter 12. Cyrus enters Babylon. The date was October of 539 years before Christ. The sources for what happened are a dry Babylonian chronicle tablet held in the British Museum, a Persian proclamation we will meet shortly, the later Greek historians, and the Bible, and they disagree on almost every detail except one. The Persian army of Cyrus defeated the Babylonian forces upriver at a place called Opis. Days later, the chronicle records, the army of Cyrus entered Babylon, and the entry into the city itself involved no battle. The most heavily fortified city on earth changed hands, apparently in a night. How? The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about a century later, tells the famous version. The Euphrates ran under the city walls. And the Persians, he says, diverted the river into a basin upstream until the water level dropped, then waded in along the riverbed while the city, caught during a festival, was drinking and dancing, and the outer quarters had fallen before the center knew anything had happened. The Book of Daniel preserves the same tradition of a doomed feast. The story of Belshazzar's banquet, where a hand appears and writes on the palace wall, and the prophet Daniel reads the judgment aloud. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. From that scene, English gained one of its oldest idioms, the writing on the wall. It is one of the great scenes of world literature. Is it what happened? The Babylonian Chronicle, written closest to the events, mentions no river trick and no feast. Many historians suspect a simpler explanation, that factions inside Babylon opened the gates, and there is real evidence that parts of the Babylonian elite were prepared to receive Cyrus as a restorer rather than resist him as a conqueror. The caution worth keeping in mind is that the texts presenting Cyrus as welcome were produced under Persian rule, by people with every reason to say so. A river lowered, a feast surprised, a city handed over. The method is probably lost for good. What is not in dispute is the shape of the campaign. Opis was a real battle and may well have been a bloody one. Then the capital changed rulers, with almost no recorded fighting inside its walls. And the last great empire ruled from within. Mesopotamia came to an end without a siege. What Cyrus did next is why his name is remembered differently from every conqueror before him in this story. He did not burn Babylon. He did not pile heads in the Assyrian style. According to his own famous proclamation, inscribed on a clay barrel known as the Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 and held today in the British Museum, he entered as the chosen of Marduk, restored the neglected rites, returned, captured gods to their home cities, and let deported peoples go home. Among those released, the Bible records, were the exiles of Judah, permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, which is why Cyrus is the only foreign king the Hebrew Bible calls Messiah, an anointed one. The cylinder has sometimes been called the first charter of human rights, and that goes further than the evidence allows. Scholars point out that it follows an old Mesopotamian formula, a new ruler proclaiming himself the restorer of order, exactly as kings of Babylon had always done. And it is a royal advertisement rather than a legal guarantee. Cyrus was not a modern liberal. He was something perhaps more interesting, a conqueror who had studied how this land worked, and who understood the pattern running through this story since the Kassites. You do not defeat this civilization. You join it, or it absorbs you. So what actually changed on the morning after? Less than you might expect in daily life, and everything in the long run. And the gap between those two facts is the real subject of this chapter. Start with what did not change. The temples of Marduk and Nana kept operating, with their estates, their herds, their brewers and weavers and scribes. The New Year festival was celebrated again. The astronomers kept watching the sky, and their records run straight through the conquest without a break, which is itself a remarkable statement about institutional continuity. Business contracts kept being drawn up in Akkadian on clay, sealed the way they had been sealed for 2,000 years. Persian kings took the ancient title King of Babylon and performed the ancient rituals, because legitimacy in this land had always been granted by Marduk, and they were not fools. Under Persian rule, Babylonia became the richest province of the largest empire the world had yet seen. Herodotus reports that it paid the heaviest tribute of any satrapy, and that a governor of Babylon grew so wealthy that he kept a stable of thousands of horses and was fed by whole districts, even discounting Greek exaggeration. The point stands. The plain of mud was still the most productive ground in the known world. Now the other side. There is an archive from this period that shows what all of that felt like from underneath. And it comes from Nippur, one of the oldest holy cities in this story. In the 400s before Christ, the house of a family called Murashu ran a business in what we would recognize immediately as agricultural finance. The Persian crown had granted estates across Babylonia to soldiers, officials, and courtiers, many of them absent. And those landholders owed taxes and services in silver. The Murashu firm leased the land, supplied the seed, the plough oxen, and the water rights, collected the harvest, advanced the silver, and took its cut. Hundreds of their tablets survive. In them you can read the names of the tenant farmers, and those names come from everywhere: Babylonian, Persian, Aramean, Judean, the descendants of people the Assyrians and Babylonians had deported generations earlier, now working ground, owned by absentees on behalf of a distant crown. That is what it means for a civilization to become a province. Not ruin, not silence. The canals still ran. The barley still came in. The scribes still wrote. And the prophets flowed increasingly to people who lived somewhere else and answered to a king in Persepolis. For roughly 3,000 years, since the first kings of Uruk and Kish, every empire ruling this land had been rooted in it. Sumer gave way to Akkad, Akkad to Ur to Babylon, Babylon to Assyria, Assyria back to Babylon, and all of it was the family quarrel of one civilization on its own soil. After 539, the center of power sat outside Mesopotamia, and no empire on the scale of Assyria or Babylon would ever again be ruled from this ground. Babylon did not accept the new arrangement quietly. Revolts broke out under Darius I, and again under Xerxes in the early 400s before Christ. And Greek sources report reprisals against the city and its great temple, though how severe they really were is debated and probably overstated. Each rising failed. Each failure left the city a little smaller in the world's reckoning and no less busy in its own. And the last chapter of Mesopotamian civilization, the one nobody expects, was still ahead, because the centuries in which this land lost its independence would turn out to be the centuries in which its scholars did their finest work. Chapter 13. The Long Goodbye. Civilizations do not always die the way cities do, in fire and a single terrible night. Sometimes they thin, the way a language thins, one speaker at a time, until a morning comes when nobody notices what is missing because nobody left can read it. This chapter covers the last 5 centuries of the Mesopotamian tradition, and it opens in 331 years before Christ, with Alexander the Great of Macedon shattering the Persian Empire at Gaugamela, in northern Iraq, not far from where Nineveh had fallen almost 3 centuries earlier. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander, as it had to Cyrus, and the ancient historians describe the young conqueror entering in state along the processional way, past the blue bulls and dragons of the Ishtar Gate, greeted by priests and showered with flowers. Alexander was captivated. Of all the capitals he took, from Egypt to the edge of India, Babylon was the one he reportedly intended as the seat of his world empire. He ordered the crumbling ziggurat of Marduk cleared for rebuilding. Then, in June of 323 years before Christ, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, after days of fever, Alexander died. He was 32. The Babylonian astronomical diaries recorded his death. These were the working notebooks of the temple scholars, and they had a fixed format A month of sky observations. Then the weather. Then commodity prices. Then whatever else had happened. All in the same clipped shorthand. On the relevant tablet, the death of the king of the world appears in that stream. A brief entry in a record whose other business that month was the position of the moon and the price of barley. It is not a poem. That is exactly why it lands. To the oldest continuous scholarly tradition on earth, the greatest conqueror in history was one line of data among others. Alexander's generals tore his empire apart, and Mesopotamia fell to Seleucus, whose dynasty made a decision with quiet, enormous consequences. Around 305 years before Christ, the Seleucids founded a new capital, Seleucia, on the Tigris, and it grew partly at Babylon's expense, with ancient sources describing inhabitants moved to the new city, and the archaeology of Babylon showing the old capital shrinking around its temples in the generations that followed. No army destroyed Babylon. That is the fact that surprises everyone, because the biblical prophets had promised its violent doom. Instead, the most famous city of the ancient world was slowly hollowed out by things as unheroic as urban planning and shifting trade routes. People moved away. The suburbs emptied. Mud brick houses, unrepaired, dissolved back into the river mud they were made from, as mud brick always does, within a few centuries. Travelers describe Babylon as mostly a memory with a temple still working inside it. And inside that shrinking city, something extraordinary was happening. The temples kept their schools, and the scholars of Babylon, in these very centuries of political twilight, produced some of the finest science of the ancient world. The astronomical diaries, kept night after night for centuries, form what has been called the longest continuous scientific record surviving from antiquity. Late Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses and describe the motions of the planets with mathematical methods of real power. Working in the base 60 arithmetic their ancestors had used to count rations. Historians of science have traced how this Babylonian work passed to the Greeks and became part of the foundation of Greek astronomy. The zodiac on the modern horoscope page descends from these temples. When the Gospel of Matthew imagines wise men from the east following a star, it reflects a reputation for stargazing that had been earned over centuries in Babylonia, but outside the temple walls. The world had changed language. Aramaic, spreading across the Near East for 1,000 years, had become the speech of the street, written conveniently in ink on perishable materials, which is why so little of it survives. Then came Greek, cuneiform, the wedge script descended from Uruk's warehouse marks, hundreds of signs pressed into clay, narrow to the temples the way Latin would later narrow to the medieval church. A learned code for priests, astronomers, and no one else. The end can almost be dated. The latest securely dated cuneiform text, currently known to scholars, is an astronomical tablet from around the year 75 of the Common Era, within living memory of the Roman Emperor Nero. There is no way to know whether it was the last one written. Others may lie unexcavated, and the knowledge may have lingered in a few hands for decades after. But somewhere in that period, in a temple precinct in southern Iraq, a scholar took a lump of river clay and a cut reed. The same two materials the accountants of Uruk had used more than 3,000 years earlier, and wrote in a script that had carried Gilgamesh, Hammurabi, the ration lists of and one furious letter about bad copper. And then that lineage of readers came to an end. There is no record of the day. Nothing marks it. A writing system with a longer history than the alphabet has today simply stopped being used, and the ability to read it disappeared with the last people who had it. What remained? Mounds. The mud cities collapsed into shapeless hills of earth, and the desert moved in. Empires passed over them. Romans, On campaign. Persians again. Then the Arab conquest, which built its brilliant new capital, Baghdad, a short ride from the buried ruins of Akkad and Babylon. Largely unaware of what lay beneath, the Bible kept names alive. Babel, Nineveh, of the Chaldees, but as legends without addresses. Herodotus was half remembered and half doubted. 35 centuries of written civilization had gone quiet, and the quiet held for 1800 years. Everything in this story, every king, every poem, every law, every date, lay unreadable beneath those mounds 200 years ago. Chapter 14. The Second Discovery. Few civilizations of such scale have ever disappeared so completely from readable history. Egypt kept its pyramids above the sand even after its hieroglyphs fell silent. Greece and Rome never stopped being read at all. Mesopotamia lost nearly everything. Its cities buried. Its script unreadable. Its existence reduced to a handful of names in the Bible and some doubted stories in Herodotus, which means all of it had to be found twice. The second finding is one of the great detective stories in the history of knowledge. And it begins with a man hanging off a cliff, high on a rock face at Behistun in Iran, beside an ancient road. The Persian king Darius I had carved, around 520 years before Christ, a giant proclamation of his victories, in 3 languages, all in cuneiform script. In the 1830s and 40s, a British officer named Henry Rawlinson copied it, at Thames, by his own account, suspended on ladders and ropes above the drop. One of the 3 versions was Old Persian, whose language had living relatives, and it could be cracked. With that key, scholars pried open the second version, and then the third, which proved to be Akkadian, the language of Babylon and Assyria. By 1857, in a famous test arranged in London by the Royal Asiatic Society, 4 scholars were given the same newly found Assyrian inscription to translate independently, and their versions matched closely enough to settle the question. Cuneiform was readable again. After 18 centuries, the silence broke. And what a moment for it to break, because the ground was already speaking. At the mounds opposite Mosul in Iraq, French and British excavators, Paul-Émile Botta and Austin Henry Layard, had been hauling out winged bulls, palace reliefs, and tablets by the crate through the 1840s and 50s, filling the Louvre and the British Museum with the art of kings whose names turned out to be Sargon II, Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal. Cities the world knew only as biblical curses turned out to be real addresses. Nineveh was found. Then came the day this story has already visited twice. In the winter of 1872, when George Smith read the flood story on a broken tablet from Ashurbanipal's library, and the Victorian world briefly lost its composure. Then Robert Colloway at Babylon, uncovering the Ishtar Gate. Then Leonard Woolley at in the 1920s, lifting the golden headdress of Puabi, layer by layer, tablet by tablet. This entire story was excavated out of oblivion, and the deepest layers held the biggest surprise. Beneath Babylon and Assyria lay a forgotten people older than both, speaking a language related to nothing else on earth, the Sumerians, whose very existence no one had suspected, were the last thing to be discovered and the first thing to have happened. Step back and feel the size of that. In 1800, an educated guess at the age of civilization would have pointed to Greece, or Egypt, or the chronology of the Bible. By 1930, humanity had recovered roughly 3,000 years of its own lost record. The earliest cities, the earliest readable writing, the earliest surviving laws and literature, and had learned that Genesis itself had older relatives written in clay. Few discoveries have moved the boundary of human memory so far in a single century. But this chapter cannot end in the 1800s, because the land between the rivers is not a museum. It is Iraq, and its modern story runs through this history like a live wire. The country's borders were drawn after the First World War. Its early archaeology carried the treasures of Ur and Nineveh and Babylon away to London, Paris, Berlin, and Philadelphia, which is why this story has so often pointed you toward museums, far from the soil the objects came out of. A fact that Iraq, quite understandably, has never stopped raising, and recent decades have wounded the record keepers of the first record-keeping civilization. In April of 2003, in the chaos following the American-led invasion, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted, with commonly cited estimates of some 15,000 objects stolen. Thousands were later recovered, including the famous Waqar vase from Uruk, and thousands remain missing. A decade later, the extremists of the Islamic State group took hammers and explosives to Nimrud, to the gates of Nineveh, to the Mosul Museum, filming the destruction of Assyrian sculpture as propaganda. A civilization attacked on camera by men who understood exactly what memory is worth, which is why they were destroying it. And yet the same years have seen the answer forming. Iraqi archaeologists back at work at Uruk, and Nippur alongside international teams. Looted objects tracked down and returned, including, in 2021, a stolen tablet of Gilgamesh, the so-called Dream Tablet, handed back to Iraq by the United States. Museums reopening, the oldest pattern in this land, holding once again, because this was never really a story about ruins. Go back one last time to that slab of dried mud from the opening. The barley account, small enough to hold in one hand. Consider what stands around it now, in the same museums, dug from the same soil. The earliest writing our species can still read, the earliest cities we can walk through, the earliest written laws we can stand in front of, the earliest angry letter from a customer who felt cheated, the earliest poem in which a human being asks out loud why we have to die, the arithmetic of 60 that still runs the clock on your wall. Few other regions on Earth hold so many of the first chapters of the human record, and a species that has forgotten where its record begins does not fully understand what its record is. We started by asking who these people were. The question worth ending on runs the other way, not whether Mesopotamia needs us to remember it. Civilizations feel nothing but what we lose in a world buried in information. If we forget the people who first worked out how to make memory outlast a human life. 5,000 years ago, somebody pressed a reed into wet clay to make sure a delivery of barley would not be forgotten. It was not forgotten. Thank you for listening.